Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and get started so that we have time for to get to as much as we can. I'm really excited to have our three panelists here today for our next installment of Homeroom with Education Leaders. This is officially a full year and then some of these webinars. So we're excited to see them keep going and to keep getting great panelists and having these great discussions. I'd like to thank our wonderful panelists today. We have John Bailey of the American Enterprise Institute, Dr. Louval Brown, who is the Superintendent of Ithaca City Schools in upstate New York, and Dr. Ann Lebo, who is Director of Education for the state of Iowa. We know that there's so much work for all three of you at this moment, so we really appreciate you taking the time to have these discussions and really just work towards solutions that are going to create great opportunities for all students. Just a few housekeeping items. If you have missed any of our past conversations, or if you would like to watch this webinar later, it will be available immediately on our Facebook page after the discussion. It will also be posted to our YouTube page, as are all of our past webinars, within the next few days or so. So please feel free to check back for that. After our welcoming remarks, we'll hear from our panelists for about 30 minutes. And then we will pivot to a Q&A. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, if you have any questions, please feel free to submit them into that Q&A feature. If you want to include your name, title, organization, all of that, so we can give you proper credit, please feel free. And then one last note, we'd love to hear from you on social media if you have any thoughts about this webinar series. So if you are tweeting about any of our conversation, please feel free to use the hashtag #Homeroom. You can also look back at some of our past discussions in the commentary that's happened there using that same hashtag. So moving on to our discussion, as we all know, this year has really presented us with some challenges that we couldn't have imagined a year ago. And we've seen so much flexibility, so much innovation in a really inspiring way. And as the vaccine has become more widely available, we're starting to see states either return to in-person learning, or if they're already doing in-person learning, loosen some of those restrictions and guidelines that have been in place. States and districts have been tasked with considering all of these needs, particularly for students and staff with pre-existing conditions or other factors that make returning to in-person learning a little more challenging. And so today we're going to hear from these three incredible leaders, and they're going to discuss what's happening to make sure that students are able to have that smooth transition back into kind of this traditional school structure that we think of. And also what we're going to keep from the past, what we're going to throw away, what is it going to look like as we move into this next school year. We remain hopeful that this will be a time for everyone to come together and discuss these best solutions and really create innovative practices that meet the needs of all students. So once again, we're grateful to everyone for taking the time to be here today, and we're grateful to our panelists for all the work that they do in this sphere already. And I'm going to turn this over to John Bailey to provide some opening remarks around what we're seeing around the country. John, can you talk a little bit about some of the trends we're seeing for states and districts as they're working on their in-person learning plans?
Great. Thank you so much. It's so good to be part of Homeroom. Homeroom was my favorite class in school too. So this is my favorite webinar. I will just give some maybe 5 broad trends and just sort of set the table and for the further conversation. But one is, I think after a year of uncertainty, we're seeing schools slowly reopen. The Return to Learn tracker estimates right now about 49% of districts are fully reopened. Only 4% are probably fully remote. And then you have about 48% of districts that are offering some type of hybrid instruction, part online. And those definitions are a little bit blurry. I think we're hearing right now about some schools that are bringing kids into the classroom, but they're still Zooming in with teachers. And so again, there's a lot of trying to feel their way forward with reopening this spring. So that's the first one. I think there's progress that's being made there. Second, I think what I'm seeing, the school systems in the states that are furthest ahead are the ones that are trying right now to assess where their students are academically, where their students are with social and emotional needs. And I think we're all sort of anticipating that there's some element of learning loss, but we're not seeing that necessarily in every state and every district, that there's some data coming back showing kids made some progress in certain grades and certain subjects. And the truth of the matter is, like, all the national studies in the world don't matter. What matters is what's going on in that school and in that state. And it's going to require states doing and schools doing their own sort of assessment of these needs in order to inform what the summer looks like and what reopening schools looks like in the fall. I think the third trend is that is just what happened last night, that the FDA approved the vaccine to be eligible now for teenagers. And this is huge because there's been a lot of research that has said that kids generally are not transmitting the virus below the age of 10. It's unsettled as to whether or not teenagers transmit the virus at the same rate as adults. And so there's this element of a vaccine that, yes, helps protect children, but also if teenagers really are transmitting the virus at the same rates of adults, then to reopen high schools, this vaccine is another tool in the toolbox, another layer of protective measures to protect teachers and to protect households and to protect the teens themselves. And so I think it brings great hopes. I also think it brings some new challenges that we're already seeing, that there are certain populations that are hesitant to get the vaccine for themselves. And we frankly don't have great research right now about what is that vaccine hesitancy for teens. And so I do worry that we're going into the summer and into fall a little bit blind, that if this vaccine hesitancy keeps playing out, if we don't address it, and if we don't answer parent questions in an authentic way, we could be setting ourselves up for some challenges in the fall. I think four, school systems and states are trying to make the most of the summer while they plan for the fall. And that is everything from summer school, from camps, from enrichment programs, but is trying to make sure that there is space dedicated for kids to address some of their social and emotional needs, as well as set them up for some academic success going into the fall. And then schools are now, in states are using the American Rescue Plan dollars to help support that, and also start making plans for the fall with reopening as well. And so I think there's a lot of hope and optimism there. And then lastly, I do see across the country, like schools taking this moment and saying, the digital divide has been narrowed. It's maybe not completely bridged, but there's more laptops and computers and more connectivity than ever before. Teachers have just all gotten accustomed to the good and the bad of Zoom and Microsoft Teams and online learning. And there is this moment to be able to sort of rethink what schooling and learning looks like going forward. And I've been tracking at least 100 school districts that have said they'll make an online learning option available for their families going forward, not because they need to because of COVID, but because some kids have thrived in that. And this is just part of the district's offering. I think other schools are going to start experimenting with blended learning and ways of leveraging online in certain ways that complement what goes on with in-person instruction that just can't really be replicated in an online way. But I think there's a lot of hope and optimism there too, that there's a way of doing education in a more equitable and student-centered way. And so those are just 5 trends, but I know we can drill down into a number of different other ones. So I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much. That's such a great overview. And thanks for bringing up the federal funds, because that's such an important part of this conversation. And we'll be talking about that a little bit more later. But I'd like to turn now to Dr. Brown to talk a little bit about what is happening in Ithaca. Dr. Brown, can you talk a bit about how you're supporting students and staff and family as you're thinking through reopening?
Of course, and thank you for the opportunity to share and learn. And it's an honor to be on this panel with such great thinkers. Yeah, here in Ithaca, we're not much unlike many districts in the country. We've seen this last year as a disruptive event for a system that was in need of disruption. For our families and for our very diverse student population, we've had to maintain a level of excellence and a level of offering. John mentioned, some families want the best that our public schools can offer, and they want it all the time. And we have had to continue that because that's an expectation for our community. And at the same time, we've had to use this opportunity to disrupt a system that has never met the needs of those who have been traditionally marginalized and oppressed. And we have a significant population of those young people and families in our schools too. So yeah, we're open. There's no longer are we using the term reopen. We are open. We've been open for a year. We're just doing this better and differently. Ways in which we're doing that, and we're committed to it. We're calling it Learning Forward, Ithaca City School District. We're partnering with young people in ways we have not before. What has been so clear to me and others is that the student voice and choice is now more important than ever. Having young people at the table with us, partnering with us as we build out curriculum, as we build out assessments, as we adjust our pedagogies has been important for us. So students as partners in this has been important. We're also, and then with that voice and choice, young people are telling us what they want to learn about. And what they want us to do is to create what we're calling anti-marginalization curriculum, where our young people are having real conversations pre-K through end of course high school about how they can be a part of disrupting systems that have been inequitable for generations, how they can be a part of helping our community solve real world problems that are relevant to this community. And most of those are around issues around marginalization and oppression, racism, classism, sexism, ableism. Our young people are having thoughtful and critical conversations about that work, and it's embedded in our curriculum and connected to our standards. Another focus for us is educator identity work. We hear a lot about culturally responsive teaching practices, but as I've said to a lot of folks often, before we can get into what it's like to be a teacher who's culturally responsive, we need to know who we are first. So we're spending a lot of time with that reflection and identity work for us as educators so that we can see how we show up in our space, how we show up in our pedagogies and in our curriculum. Only then, when we have an awareness and an understanding about how our identities show up in our learning and teaching and learning, can we then be culturally responsive to the very different needs and diversity that comes into our space. And then finally, I would say, we are enhancing and creating new supportive structures. Mental health integration is needed now more than ever. And we're having to figure out how to have our mental health supports integrated into all that we do. Communication, there's no school districts who've been great with communication through this pandemic. We're having to figure out how do we communicate with our families differently and better and in new ways. Summer school, after school programs are needed now more than ever. How do we enhance those programs? And I would say our professional development approaches have to change and are changing. And again, that professional development now includes young people and our students in ways that we weren't including them before. Quite frankly, many of our students are leading the professional development efforts in my school district now because of their authentic reflections and their authentic voice that they're bringing to the conversation. Again, that's some initial thinking of the work that's happening here in Ithaca. It's harder than ever, but quite frankly, it's more exciting than it's ever been before as well.
Thank you. And that's so interesting to hear about the professional development. I will probably have some follow-up questions for that later. But I would like to turn it over now to Dr. Lebo, the Director of Education in Iowa. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit similar to Dr. Brown about the work you're doing in Iowa to support your students and staff. I know that you all, like Ithaca, have been open for a while now, but are thinking through kind of what it's going to look like next year.
You bet. And thank you so much. And again, it's such an honor to be here with this group and kind of learn from one another. So let me talk a little bit about kind of how we got here and where we're going forward. For starters, 300, the majority of our 327 school districts and 120 state accredited non-public schools have been open daily in person since the fall. And then all of them have been offering in-person learning since February. So I think we are in a little bit of a different place in some schools, some states, but I want to kind of talk about how we got there. Certainly the path here has not been easy, and it's required a lot of commitment and work by our school administrators, our teachers, our staff. They really took on the challenge of starting the school year during the pandemic. But as others have shared, also saw it as an opportunity to rethink how to best serve our students and our families while maintaining the health and safety of everyone, certainly as a top priority. So when we first were forced to close, back in March, we really had no choice but to rethink our assumptions and figure out how to navigate really rapidly changing circumstances daily and learn from each decision point along the way as we look at that path forward. And one thing we learned pretty quickly is that some schools were more prepared than others to transition from classroom learning to remote learning. And as others have shared, different kind of learning. And so as we think about anytime we step outside of the classroom, how we better engage with our learners, this was an incredible opportunity to change quickly and to do things better and in a different way that would better serve our families. To help us with some of that, last spring, we convened a continuous learning task force which was comprised of school administrators, other education leaders, to help provide all of our schools with immediate and scalable options to finish the school year, but then to also lay the groundwork for what return to learning would look like in the fall. And so this was a continuation of our thought process of what this was going to look like. At the state level, we were able to leverage our federal relief resources to provide all Iowa schools with access to an online learning management system, so that teachers and students would have the capability to participate in high quality digital teaching and learning environments. And we wanted to make sure we were setting them up to be successful. But they also have to be connected. And so it doesn't work if you don't have that connectivity. So actually Governor Reynolds designated the $26.2 million that Iowa received in the first round of year funding to specifically address broadband access, which included funding to provide either hotspots, to pay for internet services, or offer other devices, along with funding to offer professional development to educators related to remote learning to help ensure that schools were able to offer the best educational practices possible in these circumstances. We also work closely with our public health partners to think about and prepare for a range of scenarios for educational delivery methods for the school year. You know, our process, we deemed our return to learn plans that were designed to really designate the intention was for face-to-face learning to really be the primary and presumed means of instruction. That was tied to some legislation that was passed, with some flexibility and options for remote learning in specific conditions. But the plans we knew from the beginning would have to be flexible, knowing that you might have to shift in and out of those models. So working with our public health partners, our school partners, really allowed some flexibilities for communities to provide learning in a way that best meet the needs of their learners. You know, as others have shared too, I think the consistent communication with stakeholders was so important. And I think we learned pretty quickly we had to be better at that. And that's certainly one of the things you want to continue going forward. We were able to mobilize, kind of use our Zoom capacity and online capacity to meet with stakeholders regularly, oftentimes twice a week early on, and to make sure everybody was up to date. We were collaborating on decisions. And those are practices that we're continuing as we go forward, because it helps us best understand those that we serve and really understand the needs of our state as we go forward. We also launched a COVID-19 guidance and information page, along with some return to learn resources on another site that would help schools and families provide resources for how do we better serve our kids and use these resources that we were able to offer in ways that were really most helpful for our communities. We had a 45-page return to learn support document that they could use as a template that walked through all the key areas, including health and safety measures, you know, really in detail. The other thing that we were able to capitalize on was Iowa was a recipient of one of the Rethink K-12 Education Models grants, and we received $17.7 million. And that allowed us to extend some of the current work we were doing in terms of how we reach the state in a broader scope with our online platform. And we launched something called Iowa eLearning Central, which is an online exchange for Iowa educators, students, and family that houses high quality courses and units. It supports content creation and collaboration, and it has statewide access for all grade levels. And the coolest part about it to me is that these programs are being written by Iowa teachers for Iowa teachers, and we're able to help support that financially. So I think that's been a really good thing that, again, solves a long-term problem with some resources we have now that I think will be really valuable going forward. You know, with just the big picture, as everyone has said too, of just rethinking how we connect with learning. Learning will look different. There isn't a step back to how it used to be. There's a step forward to what that better forward looks like, as has been mentioned before. And I think our ability to collaborate and work with our stakeholders will be so important. And then leveraging the resources that we have. So, you know, this has certainly been a challenging year. We've learned a lot, but we can grow from that. And I think understand that we can reimagine how we do things. And who would have thought what we've been able to do in the past 15 months? And our future is just, you know, too important not to do this. And I think that commitment to our students is just vital. And we're really looking forward to what we can gain from this as we continue to serve students throughout the state.
Thank you. And that's such a great approach and such a student-centered approach. And I'm really looking forward to digging into it a little bit more. Just a note for all of our attendees, we are going to switch to the Q&A portion now. And so thank you to our panelists for kind of setting the stage for such a great conversation. If you have questions, please submit them into the Q&A. I know a number of you submitted some beforehand that we will also get to, but if you have anything that popped up based on our intro comments, please feel free to submit them into the chat and we will get to as many as we can. I want to start with a question for John. And one of the things that really has been highlighted here is this, this need for flexibility and how not just at the state level, but also at the district level, flexibility and partnerships and communication is so important. Can you give us an example of how you've seen flexibility really be a key factor in how it impacted student outcome and student well-being?
Oh gosh, I mean, there's one word of what 2020 demanded of us isn't flexibility in many respects. And it's so true with, I think, school systems. I think you've seen flexibility and sort of permission given to try new things from a bunch of different perspectives. One, like the way the USDA gave greater flexibility for schools to deliver school meals and to do it through electronic benefits, to do it through, instead of having kids come to the school, bringing meals to the kids. I mean, that's, just fundamental in terms of student well-being. And so you saw amazing flexibility across the spectrum there, from the feds to states, down to local schools and volunteers that were working with families there. I think you saw amazing flexibilities too in terms of online learning and just the way that schools quickly, again, like it's just so incredible to think about what we asked of teachers in schools a year ago. And yes, there were problems and there were challenges and it didn't work well for everyone, but it's been pretty amazing the way a lot of teachers and a lot of schools were able to make that pivot. And to Dr. Brown's point, to keep improving it. And I think that's what is going to be needed with flexibility going forward, is making sure that schools have that permission that if they want to keep offering online learning for a segment of their kids, they have that flexibility to do that. I think we've also realized that learning isn't necessarily what takes place in a classroom for 6 or 7 hours a day, and that I think it's giving a lot more sort of momentum for mastery-based learning, competency-based, whatever you want to call it. The idea of giving students credit when they've mastered the material is something that's been very true during this experience and is likely something that's going to keep going forward if we give that permission and flexibility going forward. And then lastly, like, I just think there's a lot of flexibility around models that I think we've learned that the one size fits all really fits none. And now if we're really going to have an equitable, student-centered model of learning going forward, it's not going to be a single model. It's going to look different for different kids and different kids' needs. And we're seeing that in the summer. I think we're going to see that as schools resume. I do believe we're still going to need some flexibility. I think I'm quite concerned that there's still so much polling showing that there are some parents very hesitant about sending their kids back. There are some parents that can't wait to get their kids out of the house and back into school. But there's a group of parents that are still hesitant. We're seeing that in Los Angeles this week. Only 7% of seniors, high school students that were invited back to school went back to school. And I'm not sure if we fully understand what's driving some of that hesitancy, but there will be a portion of parents this fall that are still a little hesitant. And we have to acknowledge that, honor that, and be flexible in how do we address some of their needs and concerns and fears there.
Thank you. And I think that leads pretty nicely into our next question for Dr. Brown, around kind of some hesitancy around returning to schools. And some recent studies have found that parents of color are more likely to prefer these more remote instructional methods and are justifiably more vaccine hesitant due to historical justices as it relates to medical treatment. So do you have any thoughts about how states and districts can work with communities, Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities to regain trust and really ensure this equitable transition back into school buildings?
Yeah, well, thanks for the question. And I think it's important for us to be honest initially, and I'm going to speak both from my lived experiences and from my professional experiences. Our schools have a history and a culture of failing, suspending, denying, and testing our young families of color to tell them that they're less than or they should be excluded. So we have to name it before we can change it. So that hesitancy, from my perspective and from the folks I talk to who look like me, is really about the vaccine hesitancy. It's about the hesitancy to go back into an institution that has traumatized their family for generations. So if we want to establish trust, not regain trust, if we want to establish trust, let's talk about changing our policies, which will then result in changing of the culture. And those policies around code of conduct, how can we be more restorative instead of denying and suspending? How do we be more restorative and loving for our young people? And how do we be more culturally responsive with our pedagogies and our assessment practices and our grading practices? We're failing young people now in the midst of a pandemic more than we've ever failed them before. We look at the number of D's and F's that our young people are getting, and may I add, more disproportionately than ever before. So these families who are looking at us as an institution that has not done right by them for generations, we have to change our policies and our mindsets before they will feel welcomed or establish any level of trust. And that, again, and we can go back to communication. How many school districts are communicating very honestly who we've been, and then what we will be, how we will be different when we quote unquote reopen.
Thank you. And that's such a good point and important one to remember, thinking about really just the history of our educational system in the country. And I'm going to turn now to Dr. Lebo to talk about ESSER funding and ARP funding and other federal relief funds. I know you mentioned the GEAR funding that you all have been using in Iowa. They're just such a crucial part of developing plans for the upcoming year and thinking about equity and thinking about, really serving the needs of students who have been marginalized. How is Iowa thinking about using this money, and what are some of your priorities as it comes to these dollars?
You bet, thanks. One of the things we learned with our first round of funding is that we wanted to leverage our capacity to have the greatest impact long-term for the most learners. And so with these additional 2 rounds, as we prioritize our 10% holdback, how do we use this to really leverage work that we know we already needed to do and has just been exacerbated by this past year? So we aligned this with our priorities that would probably still be in place regardless, but I think have had a heightened awareness and more attention brought to them because they're still a concern. So our 6 priority areas are really around to provide strategies and coaching for accelerating learning. And I think we've shifted that language a little bit from learning loss to really think about, can you lose something you didn't have a chance to have, where we have students that are a lot of different places. Some have been in person every day, but we don't know the impact of what's happening at the home. Some have been hybrid and some have been online. So we want to accelerate everyone going forward. And I think that's a good model for any type of learning to help me move people forward from where they're at. So we'll prioritize that with some of our assessments, using best research practices to help move them forward. But again, using our statewide capacity to leverage support and tools for all schools to help support all learners. The second would be providing strategies and coaching for social, emotional, and behavioral health. I think, again, an area that has been an area of need that has been heightened. And so the more attention and resources we can use to support this work will be important. And we have some future announcements we're going to make in terms of some of that funding, but how can we really pay attention to our youth and adult needs? Everyone has been affected by this, but particularly youth mental health, suicide prevention, the wraparound services that we can offer. Again, we know that education is more than just the learning that happens in the school, and how can we better support the work with the communities and partnerships to support all of those needs, adult self-care and support networks, and then social emotional learning competencies for children and youth. The third would be defining the early learning through the future ready continuum. When we think about, in Iowa, we talk about a future ready Iowa, but that's all of our work. And so as we align our priorities to really fit within that model, that PK through post-secondary, how can we align our support to really allow us to have a more central focus on the work to ensure that we can get some things done? And I think we've seen that need to really tighten things up and help move our kids forward in a more systemic approach. And 4 would be provide an online learning content exchange, technology, access, and support, which we're going to be able to leverage through that additional grant. And we think we've all learned that just this past year. And we also learned that we can do this more quickly than we ever would have thought too, but we have to get better and we can continue to improve and make sure we have this as an option so that as students find different ways that are more meaningful for them or better for them to engage, everyone has that same access no matter where you live in the state. And then 5 would be provide strategies and coaching for closing achievement gaps beginning in early literacy. I think we have a unique challenge with students, particularly at the younger ages. We had a lot of families hold their kids back. And so that kindergarten and first grade groups are going to look a little bit different, and their learning is going to be quite a bit different as we move into the fall, even though we've been in school. So let's really take advantage of connecting and prioritizing that area that we know we needed to have with some of these funds, knowing that it may look a little bit differently for this next group of kids. And then, the last priority is really providing development and coaching for leadership. What a time for leadership and what a time for schools, and really understanding we need that collective support and how do we help support that process for all of our learners. I think that's something we've gotten better at, need to continue to grow with, and we want to use our funds to help prioritize that work as well.
Thank you. I'm going to now ask a question. I'm going to start with John, but Dr. Brown and Dr. Leba, I'd love to hear your perspective as well. And this is from Janet Wiesel. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name, Janet, from the Herman Fleischman Foundation. And she asks, how can philanthropy be most useful in driving and sustaining change? And how should it be investing in ways to repair or redesign or rebuild a broken system? So I guess in essence, how can we really think through systems change and long-term solutions and, making sure that, yes, we're getting through the next year and we're supporting students as they transition back in, but also really building up those frameworks to make sure that this is sustainable in the long term. So I'll start with John, but I'm sure both of you also have thoughts on this as well.
Great, Julie, and the question was how philanthropy could do that? Yeah.
Yes,
so,
yes, philanthropy. Mm-hmm.
No, it's a great question, and I know from talking with a number of philanthropies, they're all struggling and working and wrestling with this very question right now. A couple things and themes that have kind of emerged from those conversations that I think again are good for philanthropy to think about. One is that I just think more information is better at this time. That there's been something we've all been navigating the last year, and we're still in it. And it's like the COVID fog. Like it's so hard to see 2 weeks ahead of us, 3 weeks. Like it's a little bit easier. Maybe now we can see like 2 months or 3 months ahead of us. But for a while there, like it was going, just a couple of weeks ahead before we had any sort of clarity. And I think that's where, like, again, additional polling and surveying, additional ways of assessing where students are with SEL. It doesn't necessarily have to always be from a philanthropy with like sort of big national polls. It could also just be working with a school system to do a better sort of assessment of student needs, as well as like polling and surveying parents to get a sense of kind of where they are, what their hopes and fears are. I put as part of that youth voice, I think there has been a need to really capture the youth experience and what they want coming out of this and what they need, because they know better than anyone else, like where they've struggled and where they are struggling. And so I think capturing their hopes and fears and needs is going to be super important. So there's that. There's also what I have heard from systems leaders like that are on this call. The last thing a lot of people need right now are 90-page PDFs with a lot of like, do all these different things. It's like, what they need is oftentimes help, like additional staffing support, folks that can take some of these frameworks and translate it into action. And so I know there's a lot of focus right now around capacity building, both at the state level, how do we help improve that capacity, but also at the systems level, down at the school districts and the schools too. And then lastly, like I do think there's a little bit of work philanthropy can do to sort of take this moment and think about communities of practice, like with school leaders. So the fact that there's like 100 school systems creating their own online school, is like great, but also something should be linking them together. Like, are there ways for them to share courses, to share algebra teachers, to share their own lessons and what they've learned? And we should be doing that across a bunch of different verticals around racial equity and just how schools are wrestling with that at this current moment, around social emotional learning, around academic recovery. Creating communities of practice with like-minded leaders, I think, goes further than creating a whole new library of sort of PDFs. And so I would encourage philanthropy to supporting that, particularly at the state level, but all the way down to school systems level too.
Thank you. And I know I said for both of you that I was going to let you jump in, but I'd actually like to turn it to Dr. Lebo now to kind of tie in another question that was sent in to this philanthropy question. And that's if I can find it again. But yeah, so Sierra Rivera asked, how do you ensure that all voices are heard in your stakeholder engagement? And I think this is something that John brought up with including the youth voice, and that Dr. Brown has brought up with some of the work that they're doing. So, you know, thinking about philanthropy here, thinking about, you know, long-term systems building and thinking about the stakeholder engagement, kind of how is Iowa approaching that?
You bet. And I think there's two parts of that. You know, one, this past year, what we've intentionally done is really just had some stakeholder listening sessions where we did listen to parents and students and educators just to hear from them. And I think listening to the students and how they're impacted has been really important, and just letting them know that they have a voice and we want to hear what their experience was like. And what they would like to see different and what they've learned and how to move things forward. So listening and then being able to leverage what I hear and share that collectively, I think is important. But I think the bigger piece is that all of us just being reminded that this whole experience is reinforced that schools are not a single system that exists outside of the communities that they're a part of. And when you notice when schools are shut down, you see the effect it has on everything. So as we go forward, we cannot forget that essential connection to every single part of our community that we have to continue to embrace to go forward. We have to have partnerships. We have to have all of our collective voices. We have to work together to serve the full community, the families, the businesses, the students. All that must work together. And I think this forced us to be reminded of that. And that is something we need to make sure we don't forget. So as we work collectively to share this vision, we also encourage our communities to work together with their partners and understand what this means for them. You know, as we can, as you talk about connecting learning, connecting educators, connecting opportunity, we're doing that with some of our statewide platform work. But the continued message has to be for their communities to work with all their stakeholders and partners and understand that we need all of us together to go forward, and everybody's voice matters, and we need to listen in order to make sure that we're doing the right work. This gave us the opportunity to do that. We need to make sure we don't lose sight of it in the future.
Thank you. And I think those are all such great points. And I think it's kind of funny because all of these questions are tying into each other. So you once again set me up perfectly to transition to Dr. Brown. And we had a question specifically for you, Dr. Brown, from Teresa Warner, who was asking, in this work that you're doing to really affirm students and affirm members of your community, how are you ensuring that schools and teachers and students and families are able to share their authentic voices about what they think needs to happen, and you know, that they feel like they are being affirmed and listened to? As you mentioned, there's this mistrust a lot of times, and so what have you been doing in Ithaca to try to develop that trust?
Well, it all begins with self-reflection and us reflecting as a institution about where that voice is not. It's not about, you know, do we include student voice in professional development? It's more about where do we not have that voice and that authentic voice from our community and more importantly, our young people. So board meetings, do we have time embedded into our Board of Education meetings for young people to share what's on their hearts and minds and to make recommendations? Is it a part of every one of our admin team meetings? Is it embedded in our professional learning community conversations? So we now look very purposefully and strategically for where that voice is not being included to make sure it is included and make sure it's on the agenda. And then, you know, we spend a lot of time just defining what validation and affirmation means. And validation and affirmation is about, one, just validating and affirming the different cultures that exist in the learning space. And reversing the negative stereotypes that are associated with those cultures, because there is a dominant culture and a dominant narrative in our schools. And we all know that. We've all navigated that very carefully and well. But we know that there are many other narratives and cultures that come into our spaces that are having to assimilate and, quite frankly, having to give up who they are in order to be successful. So it's on us right now, when we're looking for a voice and choice, when we're looking for that authentic voice in a policy discussion around code of conduct or grading, we want folks to bring their cultural beliefs and their thinking and their histories into that dialogue. And we need to validate it and affirm it, and then use that voice to make us better the next day.
Thank you. And I'd also like to just pause here and see, I know that I was kind of jumping around to panelists and didn't give any of you a chance to follow up on any of the comments other panelists made. So I'd just like to see Dr. Lebo, John, if you have anything you'd like to add to some of these questions.
Not for me. It was just a brilliant answer. So I don't want to ruin the brilliance.
Yeah, I keep forgetting that I'm a panelist and I'm taking notes as if I'm a participant. So
Yeah, I was doing the same thing. It's funny you would say
yeah.
that.
I'm just warning you, I may forget or not hear a question because I'm just listening to these smart folks on here.
Yeah, and I think it's great as we listen to, we're all coming from such different positions here, but we all have the same ideas. We've all learned the same things and know that the path we need to go forward. So the ability for us to all connect and share that same vision, I just think is such a strong message for what the future, I really do believe there is a brighter path forward, and we are going to learn from this and we are going to make a difference. And I think it's just great to hear from others what they're hearing in the field, and this incredible partnership to talk with all of you today. I think it's really valuable, and I'm excited about what we can do.
So I'm gonna change course a little bit, Dr. Brown, I know at the beginning you were talking about student PD, student-led PD, and I would love to hear a little bit more about what that looks like, and also if you have any reflections on kind of how the events of the last year and change have kind of made you realize that that was a need and something that kind of influenced your work in Ithaca.
Yeah, and I think I've alluded to this some, but I'll be more specific. We're reading as a community Stamp the Remix. Jason Reynolds' Stamp the Remix, which is a brilliantly written book for young people that really unpacks the history of racism in this country. Our young people are leading that conversation. So again, when we think about a professional development initiative, our first question and our first thought is, how will young people lead this? So our young people, they've read the book, they've unpacked it, they have an understanding and a perspective about it, and they want to now, and they are now leading those workshops with our teachers and our community. And when I think about culturally responsive teaching practices, just pre-pandemic, I was doing instructional rounds in classrooms, and I wasn't with administrators or board members, which I've done in the past. I was with the young people who were looking for what's on the walls, looking for what literature was being represented, looking at the pedagogy. So again, every initiative has young people partnering with us to move forward. And over the last year, yeah, I think the last year we all need to be reflective about our blind spots. Yeah, because of my lived experiences, because of my professional experiences, yeah, I'm in tune to the plight of our African American, particularly African American males, and what we have to navigate in a system that was not set up to allow for us to achieve. But now I knew very little about Asian American Pacific Islanders and their struggles in our schools. And now, because of our partnerships, I'm learning something every day about the blind spots that I've held, the biases that I've held. And as an organization, what we've done to, quite frankly, marginalize a population of young people that needed us to promote their voices. So again, I think this last year should have pushed us all to be reflective of where we have been complicit in a system of oppression. And only then, when we're reflective in that way, can we get to the next level of conversation where we're disrupting some of these practices that negatively impact our young people.
Thank you. And then just kind of a follow-up to that, and Dr. Lebo and John, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this question as well, just generally, but in terms of, when we think about incorporating student voice, a lot of times, at least for me, what pops into my head is middle school and high school students. And, the voices of elementary students and, 0 to 5 are also crucially important as well. And can be a little bit more challenging sometimes to incorporate into our policies, into our strategies. So I'd love to hear a bit about how that works, what it might look like for younger students, and really how you can make sure that you're affirming the needs of young children as well.
Gosh, it's a great question, especially with young children. Like, I think we're seeing like some ed tech solutions that are trying to do that, including, it was sort of the ecosystem of different sort of platforms. Microsoft just announced, I think it was last week on Teacher Appreciation Day, that they were adding all these education enhancements to Teams. And one of them was the ability for kids to record, instead of being live like we are today, being able to get a prompt, record it, and then that would be sent to the teacher that the teacher could review. And they were envisioning it to be used for reading as part of like reading fluency, but it can also be used as a great sort of survey prompt. And then you're kind of collecting student voice that way. I think a lot of school climate surveys, are going to get retooled and revised as we go into the new school year, and that's going to be great and needed. I think student surveys are going to also be super important going forward on this too. I think there's ways to use a lot of the systems and tools that are already sort of out there. And then just also prompting students, giving students the chance to record a video, submit something. I think a number of students are really hungry for that and are just looking for an outlet. So I'm not sure if like there's a preferred method. It's just, again, looking at the tools that you have available to you as a state or within your school system and trying to figure out what's the best way of tapping. What I do worry is, like, I'm seeing this not on the student voice side, but on the parent voice. Right now, to access the American Rescue Plan dollars, schools have to develop a reopening plan, and they have to make that available for comment. And some schools have been very active in engaging their families and their community for quite some time. And so that is going to be easy. But I just saw one major school system throw up a Google form with like no description or explanation. And there's something about that doesn't feel authentic and not really sort of engaging communities, particularly communities of color in that city. And so I do worry that some of that will be a little bit of a platitude and not totally authentic. So I think strive for authenticity, whether you're trying to get a teacher voice, parent voice, or student voice. The method at which you do that, I'm not sure really matters at this point.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, Dr. Lebo, go ahead. I was about to ask you a question, so please go ahead.
No, one thing I was just going to offer is that, even when we did some student listening groups, we had elementary students, and they are the most honest, and they offer the most real perspective of what's happening. And I think the other thing is you work with those students and you observe their behaviors and how they respond to some of the learning. But I think those are important as you have these considerations. But I think any age student can offer a perspective. We just have to be willing to ask and willing to listen, and they will tell you the truth.
Yes, I know when I was teaching middle school, that was never a concern for me. But I also have another kind of follow-up question for you. I know that Iowa, for the most part, has returned to in-person learning. I do think that has been mentioned on the call, this distance learning and remote learning isn't going to go away completely, and will kind of still be part of our lives to a certain extent for a while. So have you seen any success in providing professional development around technological support, both for parents and staff and students, and just making sure that they feel affirmed technologically, which anyone who has tried to get their grandma on FaceTime knows can be difficult. So I would just love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I think that has presented itself in a variety of ways. I was going to add, we have had more schools apply to be permanent online providers in this past year, because I think they're expecting what that's going to look like going forward. We do have support groups. We have AEAs, we have local partners that help provide professional development for educators. And we've seen that some communities have provided support for families in terms of what that how to get them connected, what that looks like. So it sort of depends, but I think it comes in a variety of forms. Oftentimes it falls on the students, they understand it the best, but really this is where we probably saw the largest disparity, because it just depending on the school's preparedness to go to move forward, how far along they were in the path of already offering this. But we've seen multiple partners have to provide that support, and in communities that understood they were struggling with that connection, they reached out to local partners to try and support families for some of that work as well. But we do expect it to continue to grow and continue to be an option, because we've learned some things and we're all collectively getting better at that work and understand its right place and how we serve students as a balanced approach to meeting the needs of what our students need.
Yeah. And John, I'd love for you to follow up on that question, and if you have any perspective from a national viewpoint of kind of how that looks, would love to hear your thoughts.
Oh, sorry, and I was just responding to someone else on a question, but what looks specifically on professional?
Oh yeah, so of course, excuse me, for providing support for professional development in terms of the technology and distance learning, and making sure that students and families are being affirmed and feel like they're getting everything out of it.
That's great. Yeah, I was just responding to someone else who was asking about something. So the flip side of that, which is the technology infrastructure, like who needs internet at home. On the PD side, like I think there's a couple different things. Like one is starting from the premise of not every single teacher is going to be a great Zoom or online teacher. Like we should just acknowledge that some have taken to this medium really, really well. For other people, it is super draining and it is super challenging to just be on screen and to be engaging in sort of instruction this way. And so I think that's important, because you don't want to keep forcing teachers into a medium in a modality that they're not comfortable with, and no amount of professional development will take some of the rough edges off of it, but they're still not going to be thriving as teachers. So you want to find who are the teachers that have thrived in this medium, and then invest in them in different types of tools and resources. I think this is only going to come from you surveying your teachers and your students, but trying to figure out the right balance between asynchronous and synchronous learning, which is all the fancy techno-Latin terms we give to whether or not the teacher is live on video with kids, or whether kids are sort of engaging with some sort of online content. What worries me from the household pulse survey is that we've seen that there are some instances with low-income students that are getting no live interaction with their teachers throughout a week. And then there are some other schools where they're getting so much interaction, the teachers are just burning out because they're on Zoom or Microsoft Teams all day. And I'm not sure if we know what the right balance is yet. And it's probably going to look different for different age groups, for different subjects, and for different types of kids. But that is one of those exercises that is super important for states and schools to do now, retrospectively looking back at what worked, and then developing professional development around what's the best way of sort of doing that going forward. And then I think the other thing is PD always comes back to the tools that are being used. And so, again, there's some statewide training that can be done here, but if the training is on sort of one type of technology platform and online content, and that's not the content you have in your district, it's not going to matter. You need training and support on the tools that you and your school systems have, and making it that sort of contextual. So at the end of the day, it's how to use those in the best way possible. And that is a constant sort of feedback loop. Lastly, on that notion that not every teacher is going to be sort of a great online all-star, we should be leveraging that. Again, that goes back to this sort of idea of can districts share their rock star Julia, who is awesome at teaching algebra, and John, who is the rock star teaching, AP calculus, which is not the case. That is not what you're going to see me teaching. But is there ways of leveraging these teachers to pre-record videos and share them across districts in a way that captures sort of the best of that instructor, and then also frees up other teachers to not have to be the Zoom all-star, but instead do more one-on-ones and more small group instruction with students. Like that's a model I hope we see more of going forward there.
Thank you. And unfortunately, we're getting up on time, but I would like to kind of close out with one final round robin question for each of our panelists. And we'll start with Dr. Brown and then Dr. Lebo and with you, John. But I would love to hear, as you look forward to the next school year, what is the one thing you're the most excited about? What are you most looking forward to? And what do you think could really be impactful change? So Dr. Brown, we'll start with you.
Well, first, it was truly an honor to be here today. I've learned a lot. And yeah, I'm looking forward to being around smart people like this going forward. I'm looking forward to working harder because the work that's ahead of us is going to require a lot of hard work. And I'm actually excited about that because, for the first time in my career, and I've been doing this 25 years. Yes, I'm older than I look. I've been doing this a long time, but I've been doing this, and for the first time, I feel like we've transitioned from giving people like me a pass for saying the words like anti-racism and anti-marginalization to now giving me permission to say it and expecting us to talk about equity versus having it be a part of a conversation that was off to the side and people were just giving a pass if you were having it. So anyway, I'm excited for the hard work and I'm excited for us having the courageous conversation for the first time in my career.
Thank you. Dr. Lebo?
I look forward to education looking different to better serve every single kid and not forgetting what each student brings to the classroom with them, not forgetting what their home life is like, not forgetting what the community needs are, not forgetting that there's more to that student than what you see for the 45 minutes you have them. And so making sure we can support all those needs and ensuring that our educational systems are best equipped to help all students move forward. I think we have an opportunity to really make a difference, and I look forward to seeing that continue.
Again, I'm just honored so much to be part of this panel. I've learned a lot. I was taking notes. So just like Dr. Brown was saying, I'm hopeful. Like I do think this notion that Dr. Brown was talking about of permission. There are permission to have conversations in schools that we could not have had maybe a year ago. There are permissions given to us now by state regulators, by parents, to think differently about education in a way that was impossible a year ago. So I would take advantage of these different permissions, and it creates permission to think differently about what a student-centered learning environment looks like going forward. And we're going to need that because like when the health pandemic ends, we're still going to be in a bit of an education pandemic. The social and emotional challenges and the trauma many kids have experienced will take years to resolve. And the same thing with some of the academic learning loss. It's going to take time, and we're going to need a re-envisioned system to help meet those needs and meet those kids where they are and help them thrive going forward.
Thank you so much. And I'd just like to echo all three of you saying you learned so much. This has been really informative for me and has given me a lot of really great ideas that I can't wait to look into further. Thank you again to all of our panelists as well as our attendees for joining us today. This is such an interesting discussion. And if we weren't able to get to your question, we had a few that we ran out of time for. Please feel free to tweet at us at the Hunt Institute, and we will try to follow up with more information. Like I mentioned earlier, we'll be posting a recording of this as well as just a quick recap on our Hunt Institute blog or our YouTube page later this week. So please feel free to check back for that. And just finally, we have a lot of resources going around for COVID, and we have a number of webinar series. Our next one is Race and Education on Tuesday, May 18th at 2 p.m. on Latinx identity on college campuses. Then on Thursday, May 27th, we have our Governing Principles series on Transcending Party Lines, featuring David Axelrod and former Governor Chris Christie. So we're really excited about that one. And finally, I would just once again thank you all for listening to the Homeroom webinar and following along for the last year. And we look forward to seeing you at the next one. So thank you again, and I look forward to seeing you soon.